to the Hudson Institute side event for the International Religious Freedom Summit in Washington, D.C. The title of our event is Christian Sacred Sites, Key to Religious Pluralism in the Middle East, which is the places of origin of Christianity. I am Nina Shea. I direct the Center for Religious Freedom, and I co-chair the working group on religious pluralism and Christians in the Middle East. I am joined by my co-chair, Dr. Elizabeth Prodromou, and 3 distinguished experts with whom the working group has developed good working relationships in recent years. They have vast hands-on experience and knowledge about our topic today. We admire them greatly for their significant positive achievements on the ground, and we are proud to help maximize their efforts in Washington. We thank them for participating in this event and thank our audience for their interest. And we have very special thanks to Tawfiq Khoury, who has sponsored our working group for the past several years, enabled us to help these and other groups. And we thank Tawfiq Khoury for supporting the working group program today. Over to you, Elizabeth.
Thank you, Nina, and thank you to the Hudson Institute and to Tawfiq Khoury. It's a pleasure to welcome all of our speakers today on a topic that is essential to the survival, the sustainability, and the thriving of Christian communities in their lands of origin, in the cradle of Christianity. Each of these speakers, as Nina mentioned moments ago, works on the ground across the region. They have their own particular countries of focus, but they do similar work, but from very different aspects, all of which is dedicated to preserving the memory and sustaining the present and the future of Christian communities, and by extension, contributing to the sustainability of the rich religious pluralism that's part of the longue durée of history in the Middle East. So I'd like to introduce our 3 speakers. We have Mr. Mazen Karam, who's the CEO of the Bethlehem Development Foundation, coming to us today from Bethlehem in the Palestinian West Bank. We have Steve Rasche coming to us today. He's the Vice Chancellor of the Catholic University in Erbil, Kurdistan, Iraq, and he's also the Executive Director of the Institute for Ancient and Threatened Christianity. And then we have coming to us directly from Damascus, Syria, Ms. Sara Savva, who's the Deputy Director of Gopa Derg, which is the Greek Orthodox Patriarchate of Antioch's Department of Ecumenical Relations and Development. Thank you, Steve, Mazen, and Sara, for being with us today. I'd like to begin by asking you to share with all of us the preservation work you do and the sustainability work that you do. Tell us a little bit about the sites that you work on and the scope of your work. Mazen, why don't we start with you?
The main focus of the Bethlehem Development Foundation is the Church of Nativity. We heavily support the restoration of the Church of Nativity. This work has been going on since 2013. As soon as the foundation was founded by the late Saeed Tawfiq Khoury, Tawfiq's father, God rest his soul in peace, he realized that the Church of Nativity, as the core and most important sacred place for Christians, should be restored and cannot be left unattended. The last time restoration was to the church was 500 years ago. And this was the first time a major renovation was done, and extensive work was done. Our work is supporting the efforts of the presidential committee that was established by the Palestinian government to restore the church. So we fundraise in the United States, in the Middle East, with Arab funds to make the works. We are almost done. There is about 10% left and for the completion of the works. We care about other places, but for now and for the year to come, our focus will be about the Church of Nativity. Thank you.
Thank you, Mazen. How about you, Steve?
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank the organizers and everybody who made this possible. We're really grateful to have this platform to talk about all the work that is being done in Iraq. You know, Iraq is a place where it just seems the news is always bad. We had the visit of Pope Francis just recently, bring some positive light onto Iraq. And we hope that this discussion as well can help generate some positive discussion about things that may still come to us in the future. In terms of the site work that's being done in Iraq, there's about 25 sites that are actively being either developed or worked on. Obviously, the situation of COVID put a damper on things. But I'd like to speak from the perspective actually of all the different players who are working, because it's really a group effort that we have going on in Nineveh and Mosul. And this is really the two regions that we're talking about in terms of preserving sacred sites, Christian sites in Iraq, Nineveh Plain, and into Mosul. And within that context, there's a number of different groups that are working either in the old city of Mosul, in the church square, which everybody saw during the Pope Francis's moving visit and prayer there. We have the Dominican Clock Tower Church, the very famous Clock Tower Church. There are the Al-Tahira churches. There's more than one. And these sites are being worked on either by UNESCO, Louvre d'Orient. They're being worked on as well by the University of Pennsylvania. And in some places, the Iraqi government is providing assistance as well. So it's a mix of people that are working in these different sites together with the churches. So when I say it's a team effort, it really is, because before any of these working entities who specialize in these areas go in, the first thing you have to do is communicate with the churches and say, okay, where would we go? What makes sense, and what will we do? So once you get outside of Mosul, then there's work being done in the Nineveh Plain, in Bartala and Batnaya and Tel Kaif and some of these other places. And again, there's a mix of actors working on different churches there. Aid to the Church in Need, Knights of Columbus, again, University of Pennsylvania is in some of these spots, along with the University of Pennsylvania, Fraternité Iraq, and the Alif Foundation. So it's a lot of different sites that are being worked on, and hopefully a lot of good work to come in the future.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you. Sara, tell us a little bit about the work of GoPaDurd, the scope of the work.
Well, GoPaDurd represents the Greek Orthodox Church of Antioch in all the East, which is the oldest church in history. It's the church that was founded after the ascension of Christ, after he was crucified, and then after the ascension took place. And it's the church of the Gentiles, where the Christians were first called Christians. It's where the apostles were called Christians. And here I'm speaking about the apostles Peter and Paul, the founders of this church. In fact, right outside the window is the straight street where Saul became Paul. He walked down the street or down this road with Ananias, and then at his home or at his house at the end of the road, he was baptized to become Christian. And then, of course, all the stories of the persecutions began with the disciples, with the apostles. And it's very unfortunate that these stories continue until this day, with lay people like myself and yourself, with priests, bishops all around the world. GoPaDurd was established in 1994, and until today, after 27 years, it continues to serve up to 3.5 million people every year. We are established all over Syria with more than 100 offices and service centers. We work in all different sectors with 23 UN agencies and international organizations in different projects. In shelter, which includes rehabilitation of homes, schools, health centers. We work in WASH, which means digging and equipping of wells and providing water and irrigation systems to those who need it. We work in protection programs. We provide protection such as gender-based violence, psychosocial support, child protection to a lot of people who are in need because they've been traumatized after 10 years almost of the crisis in Syria, the least I can say is that everyone here has been traumatized. We're talking about 13 million people out of 18 million who have remained in Syria, unfortunately. And this place, the headquarters of the Patriarchate, lays, as I said, at the corner of the straight street. And also on the right side, we have the Mariamite Cathedral, St. Mary's Cathedral, which also dates back to the 3rd century. And in fact, in 1860, when the persecutions began, Saint Joseph the Damascene was actually a priest in this church, and he was killed alongside more than 3,000 believers on the same day. And so Go-Paderd believes in this journey that it has undertaken since 1994. We help people regardless of their race, background, religion, political affiliation, because 90% of our beneficiaries out of the 3.5 million I mentioned are in fact from the Muslim faith. And only about 10% or less are from the Christian faith. And this is only normal because less than 5% of the Christians that used to live in Syria are still in Syria today. Most of them chose to flee the country because of all the atrocities and the persecution that took place 10 years ago from ISIS, Nusra Front, and other extremist armed groups. And we do our best as a church to not only provide humanitarian aid, but also to try our best and advocate for the restoration of sacred sites, because Syria comes second worldwide after Jerusalem in its importance of sacred sites. I'm speaking about monasteries of Ma'lula, Saidnaya, which date back to the 6th century. And there are lots of artifacts and manuscripts that were burned. And thank God we as a church were able to preserve some of the manuscripts and ancient icons and holy shrines that existed at these monasteries. And this makes us extremely proud because we did it at our own expense. We tried really hard during the past 10 years to carry out this preservation. And then it's really sad today to see that after Christians were the minority of this part of the world, of Syria specifically, because it was Greater Syria and it covered different countries. And then it wasn't until the year 638 AD, at the siege of Damascus, that I would say Christian majority became the minority. However, in Go-Paderd, we proved that this minority is not the right word to be used. We are the yeast of society. And the work that we've been doing for the past 10 years is a witness for this. And we hope to continue for years to come in order to help. I would be hoping to help 13.5 million people, but at least to reach half this number would be of great achievement to all of us, in fact.
I'd like to ask all of you why your work do you think is so important, so urgent? You're in regions, you're in areas where there is terror, conflict, instability, and yet you go forward with preservation work or trying to restore sacred sites. Why not just wait till later? Mazen, do you want to start with that?
Lina, if we waited another 500 years, there will be no Church of Nativity. It was very, very important to intervene, and thanks to the late Said Khoury, who intervened and was able to save the church. I mean, literally, when he walked, water fell on his head from the roof. So it was about to fall. We are preserving our history. But I'm envy of Syria. They have 5%. We have 1% left. We used to be maybe 20 or 30%. Of course, we were 100% in the past, but after 628, we became less the minority. And to preserve our presence, we have to prove that our faith is still there and we protect the places. Personally, I go to every place and try to find where our origins are. And I encourage everybody to speak out. We have places that are hidden. We have to go and find them. We have the Katisma, which you visited, where Virgin Mary rested when she was leaving Bethlehem to Nazareth. I mean, it's left in the open. Nobody's worried about it. Next to my house, I mean, maybe Jesus passed by my house. I don't know. Next to my house, there is the burial place of St. Stephen's. He was buried a couple of years here before he was moved back to where the place where he was martyred. He was the first martyr in Christianity. He was stoned outside the city of Jerusalem, but because of persecution, he was buried in Ramallah here at his friend's place. So these places are a puzzle that we have to complete the story of our history. We know the history, but these connect the dots, these places. Every place is important in Christianity. We have to preserve it. And, you know, we are supported by the majority. We are supported by the majority because Muslims revere the saints, revere the Virgin Mary, revere Jesus. They also have interest to preserve this because it's part of their culture too.
Well, it was a real thrill when you took Elizabeth and me to visit the Church of Nativity and some of those other sites, Mazen. I want to thank you. It was Church of Nativity was a real gem. I think you brought in, we saw Florentine artisans and craftsmen and restoring frescoes and mosaics. It's really a beautiful place shared by, you know, really all Christians around the world. And I hope they will get a chance to visit it soon. And I'm sure it will do much to be a pilgrimage site, to have this treasure in all its glory there in Manger Square in Bethlehem will be a major attraction for pilgrims to come and be awed by it and be awed by the situation and really deepen their own faith. Steve, can we hear from you on this? Why not wait?
Sure. So in the situation in northern Iraq and in these Christian communities, you need to start with the fundamental aspect of it is that in these Christian towns, the church was the center of the community, of community life, of community cohesiveness in a way that is really just foreign to most people from the West to understand. And so that's always an issue in the restructuring, rebuilding context of things when we're dealing with Western aid agencies who might be more secular in nature and not predisposed to understanding that you can have communities where that faith element is still so central. And that's certainly the case in the Christian communities left in northern Iraq. So, you know, the rebuilding of the sacred sites is just intrinsic to any rebuilding plan that you can have for the stability of the community. Within that, there's kind of two different areas. The first is the redevelopment or the preservation and reconstruction of sacred sites in communities where the Christians have returned in an appreciable number. And those sites are priorities for the reasons that I just explained. But then you have another group of sacred sites, most prominently these sites in Mosul, where the Christians have not really returned. And so the issue is, you know, why are you rebuilding these sites? Important sites from a historical context, but from a context of today and life today, why are they important? And I'd say there's two reasons for that, and the church intends to be strong in these areas. The first is that it demonstrates to the displaced communities that the church and the Christian community writ large hasn't given up on the rights of the Christians in those places. The second is that they haven't given up hope that they might someday return. So if they were just simply to walk away and say, all right, well, these sites are destroyed and we're not going to do anything about them, we're not going to pay any attention to them, that in the context of Iraq and the Middle East, that would be a signal, a very clear signal that the Christians have given up completely to any rights, to any future rights that they might have in those contexts. So those are kind of the two ways we're looking at these on the the communities where we're actually returning and the communities where we aspire to return. And the as far as the security goes, and waiting too long, again, as I've just said, in Iraq, if you wait too long, these communities, these areas will be taken over by other people. And your ability to go back in once that's happened is really minimal in a country that is as unstable as things are in Iraq or in Syria. I'm sure it's quite the same situation there. And then the last question is, we get this from people in the West all the time. Well, the security is so bad. Why do you even waste the time trying to build anything? And the answer is, in a country like Iraq, the security's been bad for decades. And if you waited until the security situation was perfect to begin any of this work, you'd never do anything. And the fact of the matter is, amidst all of this chaos, you still have a country of people who are living and trying to move forward. So you do the best within the situation that you can. Sometimes the work has to stop. Sometimes it's prohibitive, but you have to take the long view and keep moving.
And your situation was unique in that all the Christians and the residents of these Christian towns and neighborhoods were driven out by ISIS in 2014. So they were essentially vacant after ISIS was forced out and just sitting there.
That's right. That's right, Nina. And just real quickly, so people understand, some of those towns were destroyed and some of them were not. Some of those towns were easier to come back into than others. Some of them are really heavily damaged. And again, that factors into the work that we would do.
Sara, you alluded to the pride that you have in restoring manuscripts and other sacred items, sites in Syria. Could you expand on that a little bit? Tell us about that and your 10 years in conflict in Syria. Why are you doing this now?
Sure. The truth is that we began to do it when the conflict was taking place. And I'll give a quick example of when Nusra Front attacked the city of Ma'lula, or the village of Ma'lula and the mountains. The villagers themselves, the people of Ma'lula, started to hide their manuscripts. And our church managed to enter the monastery just after, a few days after the Nusra Front armed groups started to withdraw, in order to be able to preserve as much as what was left already. And prior to that, before the armed groups entered Ma'lula, when we knew they were about to enter, we also managed to preserve as much of the artifacts as we could. And thanks God that we did that, because one of the things that the armed groups did was to bomb the holy shrine, which is located inside the monastery. And as I said, it traces back to the 6th century. So this was really painful for all the Christians in the region to have learned about this. But the question you're asking, Nina, is really important, because at the end of the day, the destruction of Christian holy sites, this culture and heritage, is not only a loss for Syria or Syrians. This is a loss for every single Christian around the world, for people who are in love with history, for people in different Christian denominations who come from different affiliations. It's a big loss for mankind, for history, really. And it's our duty to preserve this, not only for our children, but for every little child around the world who believes in Jesus, who has a little Bible in his room, and he reads these stories and he hears about Damascus and the straight street and all the saints and what happened in this part of the world. So it's really our duty to preserve this for them, if not for us. And then, as Mazen said, the first martyr, Saint Stephanos in Jerusalem, was killed in a brutal way. And today, the persecution of Christians takes place in different forms. Let us not forget the kidnapping of the 2 bishops in Syria, Paul Yazigi and Yohanna Ibrahim, and the striking silence about their abduction that is now more than 8 years. If we don't preserve the Christian holy sites for them, then who are we going to preserve it for? We owe it to them. We owe it to Saint Stephanos. We owe it to Saints Peter and Paul. We owe it to all the saints of the Christian church who are now watching us. And I'm sure if they were here today, with their courage and their nobility, I am sure that they would fight for it the same way they did before. They would want to go under persecution once again in Rome and in different parts of the world, just as they did before, in order to preserve this. So what are we going to do, to sit and watch? No way. We will definitely continue to preserve these holy sites and these ancient sites, because they represent us. They are living museum. They are the living Bible. They still exist. And I would not want to reach a part of the future with our children and grandchildren and just explain to them what the Bible is or what this holy site used to be, but I would rather have them buy a plane ticket and go there for themselves and see it. This is what I really aspire for. And again, as I say, this is important for Christians all around the world, not just for those living in this region or Syria in particular. Because for Christians in Syria, if I would just give a quick example, Christianity to them and faith is a way of life. They're really committed to it, and it's really difficult for them to feel that the church they once used to go to, or the priest they once saw, or the manuscript they took a look at is no longer there. So by preserving it, we are actually giving them hope. They trust in life again. And also we have encountered a lot of people who wanted to flee the country. But then once the rebuilding of those churches and monasteries that were destroyed started to take place, they were encouraged to come back. I remember a picture went viral on the internet about 3 to 5 years ago. It's concerning St. George Church in Homs, which was completely destroyed. And there was a couple from Homs who insisted to be married in that church. So you can see part of the altar was still there. And there were no roofs, ceilings, there was no walls. But then the ceremony still took place, and there was a priest there because they believed that since the church was inaugurated and it's blessed with the Holy Spirit, so it's still a church. And the altar is still an altar, and they were wedded there. So this really shows the resilience of the Syrian people that are a little bit different from other maybe countries, neighbor countries. With Syrians, they don't really fancy going abroad or filing for immigration or searching for other places to go to if they have an option to stay.
Thank you. I remember that photo very well, and well said. Thank you all for your insights on that. Elizabeth?
Yeah, thank you, Nina. And I'd like to continue with Steve and Sara right now. I mean, because you are working under conditions of active, low level, sometimes full-blown conflict. You continue to work in those kinds of conditions. So I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about the decision-making process. Resources are short, but needs are great. So what's your decision-making process when it comes to prioritizing what sites to address, to preserve? And I'd also like you to tell us a little bit more. You've already touched on it. We tend to think of sites only, Christian sites only in terms of churches, but there's a whole panoply: chapels and monasteries, libraries in particular, and ancient texts which are preserved there, historical records, things like liturgical vestments and vessels. Could you tell us a little bit about how you make the decision about what to prioritize? Is it based on funding availability? Is it based on who's still there in terms of the local community, or the demonstrated desire of IDPs to return? Sara, why don't we start with you, and then we'll go to Steve.
It's a very good question, Elizabeth. Thank you so much. This depends really on the funds, because when it comes to sacred monuments, this requires a lot of attention to detail. It requires specific line of expertise, people who are really specialized in this kind of restoration work. Whereas community churches can be rebuilt using the aid of community and the engineers from the community, funds from the church, and this does take place. We have already rebuilt several churches from our own funds and from the help of the community. But when it comes to sacred sites, and please allow me to say this, that sanctions over Syria that have now gone even worse with the impact of Caesar Act, which was imposed last June 2020 on 17th of June, it has made it really difficult to have specialized craftsmen come into Syria, let alone order material that is really needed to restore sacred sites. Because when it comes to sacred monuments, even the way it was built is different than local community churches. This requires expertise from abroad. I'm talking about people who understand how Byzantine architecture and engineering works, because this is how the sacred sites here in Syria have been built. And I'm talking about, as I said, centuries and centuries ago. So this really requires attention, of course, to funding. It requires more money and definitely the lifting of sanctions, which will allow for this whole operation to take place.
Thank you, Steve.
Yeah, in the situation in northern Iraq, it's really a case-by-case thing. Most of you are aware, Nineveh is in fact two separate regions, one region controlled by the Kurdistan regional government and the one region controlled by the Iraqi government nominally. And then within the Iraqi sector, you have the presence of the various paramilitary units, the popular mobilization units, so-called, that have their own area of sway. So each area, in terms of being able to do work, has its own set of criteria about in terms of what you can do successfully at any given time. So that factors into it to begin with. But the second thing is really the, as Sara just mentioned, the availability of funds, because funds are made available for specific purposes in one area that aren't in another area. And so a good example of that is, of course, public funding, say, for instance, from the U.S. State Department or USAID is not generally going to be used to rebuild a church. They're going to focus on rebuilding houses, schools, roads, and these types of things. Where there's coordination on that, and we did have some of that under the Trump administration, especially in the last couple of years, was a coordination where the big aid would focus on the kind of basic needs things, and this would allow the private institutions such as Aid to Church in Need, Knights of Columbus, Louvre d'Orient, and others to then focus on the more purely sacred sites, religious sacred sites. And that would run the whole spectrum from rebuilding and restoring churches and specific religious sites to the preservation of documents, to the preservation of religious items and the rebuilding of those things. So it is really a mix. And in terms of deciding on the priority, in Iraq, the immediate future changes so rapidly that you kind of look and say, okay, well, where are you going to get the most efficient use of these funding dollars? And again, where possible, we try to do that in a team approach. So the churches will sit down with the various private providers of aid and say, okay, in this town, here's what we really need. We really need a community center and not a church or another church. A lot of these areas have one primary church and one secondary church. And oftentimes the secondary church is the older one. And from a purely historical, archaeological standpoint, you might say, okay, we'll preserve that older one first, but it may be of a lesser priority. But it's really listening, to the communities themselves, and they'll often say, look, okay, we have the one church. This is good. Thank you for this. What we need is a community center. We want to be able to celebrate marriages and ceremonies and things like this. The other part of warp and weave of our lives that make us fully alive, full citizens. So it's a case-by-case thing.
All right, over to you, Nina.
So you're touching on the next question, which is your sources of funding. Are they public or private or a partnership of both? Do the local authorities, do your local governments pay for any of this restoration, or any regional governments, or the United States? Are there, I'm aware there are funds to restore sacred sites. Steve, you talked about a little bit in U.S. budgeting, USAID. And I just wanted to know if any of you are receiving USAID or US funding to do this as well. So Mazen, go ahead.
Our sources of funding are mainly from the United States, from France, especially for the Church of Nativity, from individuals. The US government has not forwarded or accepted any of our requests for funding because they are conditional to funding based on their agenda, which does not match our agenda. So we were not successful in getting any USAID funds. We were able to get funds from the Arab funds. You know, the Arab funds, they have a pool of banks or national funds. Together, they assign 10% of their profits for helping Palestine. So we were able to get from the Arab Fund for Economic and Social Development 2 donations to support the Church of Nativity, which we did not get from Christian countries. So this is very serious. We really need the US government to understand that these offers are important for the sustainability of Christianity in the region and in the world. Most of our visitors come from the United States, and most of our individual donors come from the United States. But really, USAID can do a lot to help us in this funding. The day-to-day operations are still being sorted by the founders of the foundation, Consolidated Contractors Company, Tawfiq Khouri and his brothers, Samir and Wael. They are supporting this effort. It's a private initiative and continues to be private since its inception in 2011. So thanks to them that we are being able to do this work.
Thanks, Mazen. Steve?
So as I said earlier, our funding is really a mix of public and private. From the public side, some of these sites are funded by UNESCO, primarily the work at some of the churches in Mosul. They're working in collaboration with various other groups. Department of State, US Department of State has done some funding, a lot of that through a contract that they gave out to the University of Pennsylvania and the people there who are really, world-class in some of this work. And I have to say that people from the University of Pennsylvania have been very good about reaching out to the local communities and helping them to determine priorities. Department of State also helped out directly in the restoration of the shrine of the prophet Nahum, the Old Testament prophet, which was a sacred pilgrimage site for Jews before they were expelled from Iraq. And that's in the town of Al-Qosh. There's been a really great preservation effort that's gone on there. And that, again, is a combination of work between the Chaldean Church that had been the custodians of the site since the Jews were forced out, together with the preservation group Arch International, and then a big grant from the Department of State. So there's a mix of government actors and public actors. The Iraqi government does provide some minimal funding in some of these areas, but to my understanding, it's primarily using money that comes to them from someplace else. As far as the private donors, generally from the Christian community, again, Aid to Church in Need, Knights of Columbus, Louvre d'Orient, Fraternité, some of these others, they've been really great in helping out in these things. They've been there for a long time, working in these areas since even some of them since well before the ISIS war. So those are our 2 main sources of funding. We get them from both places.
Great, Sarah. Go ahead, Sarah.
All right. When it comes to, let's say, restoring the churches and the holy sites in Syria, we have so much difficulty, first of all, to convince people who are representing, international platforms and decision makers and the mainstream media that Syria is in fact in need of this type of funding, because Syria has not been on mainstream media for a few years now. And this is really sad because the crisis is not over. And with COVID-19 and the inflation of the Syrian pound that changed 3 times in just a year and a half, I assure you that people are back to square one. Everyone is back to where they started. They are in need of the most basic life-saving items on everyday basis. They cannot even afford to pay rent, let alone go to the doctor or send their children to school nowadays. When it comes to funding, as I said, when it comes to churches, we are providing this funding from our money, from the church's money, as much as we can, of course. And when it comes to the sites, the holy sites, we have been advocating for this for years. We did travel to Europe and we met with organizations who were interested in this kind of funding. And we heard that they were able to allocate funds for this, but we have not been shared of any update, and we did not receive any funds. This is 2 years ago. We are still waiting. Perhaps there's an issue with moving money to Lebanon. Perhaps because of the situation in Lebanon, they might be a bit hesitant to do this. I'm not sure. But yes, we really need organizations to step in and take this matter seriously, because the more we delay this, as Stephen said before, the worse it will be in the future, because it will require more funding and it will require more paying attention to details, as I said, which would require a lot of work from professionals. And when it comes to preserving delicate places like sacred sites that trace back centuries and centuries ago, as you know, when we travel to museums, we see how people at the museum are always paying attention to making sure everything is well preserved. And this is what we want to do with our icons, with our manuscripts, and with everything else that represents a church, and how a church should be formed from the inside and the outside. So this is why we really need that international communities are well informed, first of all, about the situation in Syria nowadays, and that they are tolerant of the truth, and that they don't mix politics with what's going on inside the country when it comes to this kind of work, because we don't want to wait 100 years until the situation in Syria is recognized, just as it took 100 years for the whole world to recognize the Armenian genocide, for example. We really advocate for the international community to pay attention to what's happening and really speak up and provide, I would say, restoration saving ideas and action that would actually take place sooner than later.
Well, this I have a hard question for all of you, and it's been a hard year with the COVID and the pandemic sweeping the world and locking us all down. But we're emerging from that. But my question, and it's really a factual one, and if you could just give a quick answer so we can get to more questions. Have you seen results from your work so far? You've all described a situation where the Christians, I think, Mazen, you said that, what was it, 1% is, I missed what the percentage, but maybe you could tell us again, but number of Christians left.
1.7%.
What?
Less 1.7%. Less than 50,000 Christians in Palestine.
Okay, so have you seen results from your work that are drawing Christians back? And if you could just quickly give that answer, yeah.
Yes, the year before the COVID,
yeah.
the queue at the Church of Nativity was not seen before at any time. The queue went all around inside the church, all the way back to the square, and the wait was like 3 hours.
Wow.
But of course, after the COVID-19, it stopped. Now it's going to pick up eventually. But yes, we have seen big results because of our intervention.
Pardon me, Steve.
Well, in terms of seeing people come back, it's really too early to tell on that. COVID is still a real thing in Iraq as it is in Syria, and so the working out of that situation is still affecting things. But what I can say is that it has absolutely slowed the exodus. And I think this is probably as much as we can hope for right now, and hopefully that it'll stabilize the exodus. Whether it reaches the point where it induces people, for instance, in the diaspora in Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan. I mean, there are well over 100,000 Iraqi Christian refugees in those three countries right now. Whether this work will induce them to return is a long-term question. I think the best we can realistically hope for now is that this gives some incentive for those who want to stay to stay.
When it comes to Syria, before the crisis, there were around 2 million Christians living in Syria out of the 24 million Syrians in total. Today, we have around 800,000 Christians only living in Syria. Now, when it comes to returnees, I want to speak about two types. So we have IDP returnees and then refugee returnees. When it comes to Christian IDP returnees, yes, the movement is quite fast inside the country because Christians who fled a certain town of origin were very eager to go back when the church of that town was rehabilitated or restored. But then refugees, Christian refugees outside of the country, as Stephen said, at the moment, it's hard to track it down because when we get numbers and statistics from, let's say, UNHCR, telling us that around 100,000 refugees came back to Syria, they're not really segregated by religious affiliations. So I would personally take an assumption and say that not a large number of Christian refugees came back to Syria out of the 2 million.
I'd like to talk a little bit about the auspicious month that we're having this discussion. It's July now, and for the past 2 years, July has been an important month for the preservation of sacred sites, in particular Christian sacred sites, because in July 2019, UNESCO removed from the list of endangered World Heritage Sites the Church of the Nativity. And Mazen, the removal from the list of endangered sites is, I would say, overwhelmingly the result, if not fully the result, of the work of BDF, the Bethlehem Development Foundation. And thank goodness, thank God for that, the site being removed from the list of endangered sites. But in July 2020, last year, the Turkish government reverted the ancient Byzantine Orthodox Cathedral of the Hagia Sophia to a mosque. And the Turkish government has made changes to the physical structure of the Hagia Sophia in the last year. And the international community has expressed dismay, but otherwise hasn't done anything concrete. So in both cases of the Church of the Nativity and the Hagia Sophia, we see that the international community has in many ways been on the sidelines when it comes to the work that you all are doing for the preservation of sacred sites and the communities who use them, and those sites, as you said, Sarah, that are World Heritage Sites. Tell us what would be the most important thing for your work for the international community in terms of providing help, and especially as you move forward, tell us a little bit about the next preservation projects that you're working on. Mazen, why don't we begin with you?
You are right. Thank you for pointing out this. Actually, it is a team effort. It's not BDF alone. There's a presidential committee for the restoration of Church of Nativity. There's a municipality which is undergoing works now in Star Street. You know, the World Heritage Site was the procession of the patriarchs. It starts from Jerusalem Gate and goes through Star Street to the Church of Nativity and all the way to the Milk Grotto Street, where the Virgin Mary used to breastfeed Jesus, which is probably 500 feet from where he was born. So all that corridor has been removed from the World Heritage Sites in danger because of the restoration works that happened in the church. Now, what I think that the intangible culture is as important as the tangible culture. The procession of the patriarchs that starts from Jerusalem and goes to Jerusalem Gate outside Bethlehem, Mar Elias, St. Elias, and then goes to the church. And from the church, the shepherds come from the fields nearby, down the hill. All this procession is intangible culture. The way the whole community celebrates Christmas. We are endowed with sacred sites that Jesus walked in, or he was raised there. So the celebrations that happened to it, Palm Sunday, where Jesus walked triumphantly into Jerusalem, all this collectively should be also World Heritage and should be preserved to preserve our culture, our heritage, and to preserve Christianity for the next thousands of years. It is very important to do that. But the work of the other work is also important. We are not forgetting other works in the region, but this is the most important work that I think should be added to the World Heritage.
Thank you, Mazen. Steve, how about you with regard to Iraq and the Christian communities there? What is most important for the international community to do?
Well, I think the one thing that we're really trying to get across is the possibility and the potential for these religious historic sites to become the driving force in developing anchor developments around the issues of pilgrimage sites, historic tourism, and that sort of thing. You know, the examples exist in other parts of the Holy Land have shown that these types of economies can be sustainable and can be meaningful. And for the situation in Iraq, to the extent that we can tie in not just the reconstruction of a building to serve as a museum, no, reconstruction of a sacred building to serve as a centerpiece for a community of livelihoods that can be built up around it. That's really where we're trying to go and make the West understand that these sacred sites can be really important places to provide meaningful livelihoods for the people if they're used as a center for a larger scale development. That's where we're hoping to go, because we believe these things can be sustainable over time.
Thank you to both of you for highlighting this intersection between places and the things that occur in them and around them, and the connection between culture, livelihoods, economies. Sara, this is something that GoPaDurd works on directly. Tell us a little bit about what you would call on the international community to do most crucially and urgently.
Well, for the past 10 years in Syria, especially the first 7 years, I would say 6 to 7 years, we were working in emergency response because GoPaDurd's programming strategy moves from emergency response to early recovery and then to livelihoods, as you just mentioned, Elizabeth. So at the moment, and after I would say more than 70% of the Syrian land, military-wise, is now safer. There's no military conflict in almost 70 to 75% of Syria in general. So now is the time where we enter from early recovery to sustainable development and livelihoods. And this specific period of time is crucial because every project that you implement now in Syria will actually be sustainable for years to come. And this is what the Syrian people are actually looking forward to, because they know and they're very aware that one day, really soon, all the INGOs, the international actors who have been registered in Syria, are going to withdraw and move all their work and employees to different countries that have different crises. So when it comes to the international community, I just want to send a message to say that what happens to Christians in the East is not just in the East. It will one day affect Christians in the West, because we are all united, whether we know that or not. We are all united because the Church of Antioch, the Greek Orthodox Church of Antioch, is also referred to as the Mother Church. as the church of martyrs. And this is where it all began. As I said earlier, the Bible still lives here. You can see it, it's a live museum. And I advise and invite all the international actors and who have never been to Syria to actually come to Syria and formulate an image and a picture of what's happening, which is the truth, which can sometimes be different than mainstream media. And we in Syria, and even in Gopa Dirt, for example, or in Gopa, we feel really united with all the different Greek Orthodox churches around the world, or the Orthodox churches, when it comes to the Russian churches, the Serbian, the Armenian, the Greek. We are always listening, and we have translations of what saints in different Orthodox churches say. For instance, Saint Paisios, Saint Porphyrios, Saint Seraphim, different saints from different Orthodox churches around the world. So this is why we feel as one, we feel united. And we call for all the Christians around the world, regardless of which denomination or church they belong to help their mother church, because this is where it all began. Today, we all visit museums. We all travel to different countries and we visit museums that either portray paintings and art that goes back to centuries before, or sometimes we visit museums that show us remnants and pieces of memories that remained from World War I and World War II. And this is why it breaks my heart to see that ancient sites, sacred sites that trace back to centuries where saints actually passed, or where miracles happened, or where, as Mazen said, in Jerusalem, Virgin Mary was once there, or Jesus once walked there. And in Damascus, where St. Paul walked and different saints were actually persecuted. It breaks my heart to see that this is not on the top of the list of a lot of decision makers and people around the world, and it should be, because this is also history. The Bible is history, regardless if you are a Christian or if you are someone from another religious affiliation, or if you don't believe in the existence of God at all. But it's something we respect and we value because it's history, it's identity, it's culture. It's something that future generations should aspire to see and to visit. This should not be a part of the world or the Middle East that's always referred to in politics as, let's say, a scene where there's lots of chaos and war. I would like it if in the future it would be referred to as the place where it's a live museum. You can actually go there and see things for the first time that you never imagined you would see. Civilizations that trace back to centuries ago. Damascus is the oldest continuously inhabited city around the world. It's one of the oldest, and it's beautiful. When you walk around the old city and the old streets, you can feel it, you can sense it. You can still see the Roman Empire's touch and footprint with the columns, the Roman columns. You can still visit the shrine of John the Baptist, which is right next door. You can see the martyrs and the saints where they walked and where they have been persecuted. And so this is really important. And the second thing, which is really important for the international community, as I said earlier, is to lift the sanctions of Syria, because I assure you, and I want to say this by just being frank, I live in Damascus now, which is the capital of Syria. And I assure you that the sanctions are not affecting the individuals that it is meant to affect. Instead, it's affecting the lay people, the rest of the population who have nothing to do with all this mess and all this crisis. They are the ones being affected. Their lives are changing. And in Gopa Dirt, our mission is to change lives. And we need the support of the international community to do that. And when it comes to the Christian culture and the Christians in Syria, part of the culture of the Middle Easterns is that they're really attached to their church. It's all about family here. So the church is important to them because this is where they carry out baptisms, weddings, funerals. It's where they go on weekends to talk to priests because they hold seminars in order to speak to the people. It's where confessions take place. And this really is I would call a church like a hospital. It's where the priest is a doctor and they really heal the souls of the people. Because for Christians in the Middle East, the church is not only about praying on Sunday, but it's about us becoming spiritually healed, because life is not only about physical and material subjects or pleasure. It's also about spiritual healing and spiritual advancement. And this is really important for Christians in Syria and in the region, that they're really attached to their church. So when we renovate it or when we bring it back to life, we give them hope and trust in life because they are so close to despair that it's really painful.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you both, Steve and Sarah, for highlighting the importance of seeing with our own eyes, visiting the places that you're doing work. And Nina and I have been fortunate enough to visit all of you. And so, Mazen, would you like to close out and then we'll conclude?
One thing that I want to point out is the Christian writings, especially in the early centuries of Christianity, and especially in Iraq, which Steve should know about. Thousands and thousands and thousands of books have been written by Christians, even after the coming of Islam. They were still the writers, the translators. They were responsible for transferring the Western culture, the Greek literature, into Arabic. They were the doctors for the presidents, the Khalifa, the Sultan. There's a family of doctors that was continuously for 200 years the doctor of the Abbasid caliphates. So that's also has to be preserved, the writings of Christians. And there's Germans who wrote about this. There's a book that has thousands, all the names of the manuscripts that are in Germany in museums, and these have to be also preserved in one place. Thank you.
Thank you, Mazen, for highlighting that, because in terms of what the international community can do, I can support, one of the things it can do is support digitization projects, and digitization in particular, using forensic tools of the vast, historical repositories of texts in the region. And then, of course, visiting the region. So reading, learning, and then visiting. I want to thank all three of you for being with us today. I want to thank the Hudson Institute and, of course, Nina, the Center for International Religious Freedom. We've come to conclusion. Thank you also to Tawfiq Khoury for supporting our working group. And you can find, for those of you who are interested, you can find more information available on the websites of the three organizations. Thank you for your sacrificial work on behalf not only of the Christian communities in their lands of origin, but also for the world, the entire world. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nina, and thank you,
honored to be
Elizabeth.
here. Thank you, everyone.